Hello everyone, today we talk about the medieval Christian Iberian armies organization. We will simplify this talking about, late medieval Spanish or Iberian armies, meaning in fact specifically the Christian ones, and yes, between essentially the 14th and the 15th century. We will surely talk at some point a bit more in depth about the single, of course, Iberian polities at this time. I still haven't made a video dedicated singularly to Navarre, for example. At some point we will have to deal with that. But of course there were enough similarities for us to draw some conclusions. Also because, on this basis, also because the, Iberian warfare does follow some, overall patterns that are different from the ones of Western Europe. This is due to, in fact, the topic I would like to come back on a bit more frequently. That is to say, the actual degree of Iberian military development during the Middle Ages, because it's not much. Probably, the differences were not enormous, right? But what we encounter a great problem of in documentation in different times of Iberian history, and picture that fundamentally is not present anywhere in Europe, considering the massive system that the Caliphate had constituted and the Christian sweeping of the same, which, albeit of course grafting on the in fact previous military systems, also sort of redrew them, and in a very, let's say at least in the Reconquista, in a very fast way, especially talking about the 13th century, much faster than even the quite shattering dynamics, for example, that had brought the Capetians to the conquest of Occitania, etc. Something much softer in comparison to what happened in Spain instead, and again on a truly different basis, right? In as we'll see now, in a way that makes us realize not just that up to a certain point and fairly late in time, the Iberian military system had, even in the Christian side of the story, in spite of its specificities, been substantially different from the Islamic one, but also from the Western one, and that when the Islamic one was overrun, still the Iberian rulers required an important deal of that, the very communities that had subjected, and that took centuries to actually dilute into the broader fabric, right? And that yet were ruled over by pretty imposing systems, such as the Castilian one, for example, but say all the Iberian monarchies being quite relevant in the scale of army organization that required, because of this incredibly quick conquest of the south, in fact, quite different ways of handling the local rule, and consequently also the military system, the levies, the forms of participation to warfare in general, not just from a military, but also, for example, from a financial point of view. The rest of Western Europe had fundamentally, instead, a gradual stratification, more or less on the top of the same type of governments that existed at some point. Politically, you can find a system rising or falling, but in many ways, they were actually always the same system that just maybe changed names, witnessed dynastic substitutions, or maybe some temporary foreign dominations, but at the end of the day being always based on this core. This, of course, in part happens also in the Iberian Peninsula, but the crisis that had invested the taifas had been so irrelevant and so deep, let's say, also in a diachronic sense. It had old roots, and sort of here you encounter really two very different worlds, also in terms, in fact, of temporal separation, right? The Muslim system had relied on what had historically been like a Byzantine influence one. Still, the idea of a centralized bureaucratic state with a permanent army that at some point exhausts itself, that had already witnessed, of course, some forms of privatization or semi-feudalization, but that eventually is run by the actual instead epitome, the peak of that, given that at least the northern Christian rulers were significantly influenced by, to say the least, by that point already by the Frankish model, the Western Frankish system. And that yet was not just about, I don't know, couché charges or, thickly packed heavy cavalry formations, or merely a matter of equipment or technology. Actually, it seems that Spain had, even in great, advanced, temporally speaking, some at least displays of specifically advanced technologies, right? But a completely different thing is how eventually you organize the system politically and socially, and the question especially remains, and this is mostly something revolving around the High Middle Ages, not the late one, that we have to investigate. We already made some videos about this, is how actually developed also technically the previous system was, and what was the actual management of this by the northern Christian armies. Of course, everything was eventually blended in together, like the differences also within Spain were very important for the time being, but not so radical, like in terms of material culture or whatever. But the system is so big, right? The Iberian Peninsula being effectively bigger than France, even though, I just say it for the sake of potential provincial diversifications, because otherwise France was much bigger, like in terms of actual population and resources. But they were also comparable, right, by scale, and as such, especially considering the fairly, especially in a longitudinal way, the fairly, framed, right, and stable direction of expansions of the respective Christian monarchies, like the Christian monarchies in their respective areas, you do have a fast but successful unification. So these military systems did work, right? And the main, comparison that you can, at least the main factors you should also consider in this comparison with especially the rest of Western warfare that was pretty homogeneous by this point, right? And at large, also the Iberian system is pretty much the same, right, at the core aspect. But is the degrees of, in fact, militarization due to the different historical development of the areas. Spain had developed culturally and identitarily with the Reconquista, and this had historically, organized the armies that just mobilized the populations in general, even in terms of contributions, in quite, in fact, different ways from the ones the rest of Western Europe had done. It was sort of a more totalizing dynamic, like at least communities, but also lesser people were invested more directly in the general raiding type of warfare that characterized the Reconquista. Yet, and this is in fact not much of a great indicator, because at least the most advanced militaries in Europe were like just any advanced military, the one that can effectively separate like the military, the professional element, from the rest of the system that works for it, right? So in this sense, it seems that Spain had been somewhat by the late Middle Ages, somewhat, right? And that's all in this adverb, but sort of military backwater, right? It does seem that the participation to the Reconquista had been heterogeneous. There were, the communities of the north were very invested in a general fought for the war, but they did not live on the frontier, right? Already from a couple of centuries. So things do change, and also the internal balance of Iberia is mostly now about the competition between the various monarchies. In fact, there is a lot of warfare between these, but it does seem, in fact, that, as we will evidence now, during the Iberian theater, in the Iberian theater of the 100 Years' War, there had been sort of more looser forms of military associations, of sort of less functional or fully statalized ones. And this also has to do, of course, with the way the single monarchies had developed. It is true that the Iberian continental, say, the Meseta, etc., has more isolated nature compared to the developments of Western Europe, like northeastern Spain. The Crown of Aragon was sort of much more, in fact, receptive. Also Navarre, to the Frankish, to the Italian influence. But it's also like a different type of making war in the first place. And today I cannot simply make the video about the comparison, but I talked this as the country seems to have been dragged rudely back into the mainstream of European warfare exactly at this point, like essentially after the mid-14th century crisis that had struck Spain, as the rest of Western Europe, in pretty hard ways. The Iberian monarchies, we made some videos recently about them, are actually and precociously developed in a politically unitary sense. The impression, though, is that especially in Castile and Portugal, the general development follows also a pattern of private clientelism of sort. Yes, the cities are important, but fundamentally, it's the nobility, it's the clergy, it's the lay aristocracy that take over the largest estates and do not really build this power through a significant, let's say, fixing of the post-Reconquista society, but rather with the oligarchic takeover of the same. And this also works by a decree, because at least the knightly elite, for example, the Reconquista had always been quite valiant and renowned. There were the military orders. By the way, today I will not talk about the entirety of the Iberian army organizations, because there are, in fact, we will talk mostly about the royal contingents, like mostly the ways they were levied overall in a pre-orderly fashion that was, as we will see now, modeled after the French or English ones. But there were also the urban militias, the Hermandad, then the Adalides, then again the military orders. We will not talk about the Mudéjars. I made a video at least about them at some point. Also one about the navies, especially the Castilian one. It was the most important. We'll have to talk about the artillery, and again today we don't talk about Granada either. But I mean, there is really a lot of stuff about late medieval Iberian warfare, and this is just like a timid beginning to show, however, how the Iberian monarchs would update their army organization on the model displayed by the English and the French, right? And the reason being, in fact, the involvement of the true and direct involvement of these foreigners in Aragonese, Castilian, and Portuguese politics and warfare at large, which historically, let's go immediately in medias res, right? This, as you know, had to do with the support provided by Charles V of France, the papacy, and King Peter IV of Aragon to Henry of Trastamare, who was a claimant to the Castilian throne, at that point held by his half-brother Peter the Cruel. Alright, so this is the Castilian Civil War that brings the French to, specifically, as we will see now, because they were in charge mostly, the other powers financed the thing financially, but France was essentially the largest power capable of intervening at that level. And that involved, in fact, the command of the French force, even the future constable of France, Bertrand du Guesclin, that we haven't ever made a video about. I told about him so randomly during the video, in the videos about the 100 Years' War. But you have other important names, such as Marshal d'Audorem, also the English knight Sir Hugh Calveley, that were respectively the second and third in command of this force. We're talking about a pretty sizable force. We are at the end of 1365. Something from 10 to 12,000 soldiers. Froissart, I made a video about this, Franco-Flemish chronicler, 30,000, and likelihood is actually for the smaller cipher, but here I don't have time to digress on the hows and the whys. When we talk about the actual campaign, the story of the Castilian Civil War, they will descend into it. But they were, again, we were talking 1365, like Europe is at this point re-emerging gradually, but it's still pretty shattered by the pretty heavy demographic and economical crisis that had struck it. It's been shrank in size dramatically. Armies were normally not too big, and consider that this was an expeditionary force that would be integrated with other Castilian forces. 10, 12,000 sort of makes sense, and it's not just about the quantity; it's also the quality. 30,000 men would be like a field, an entire field army, so that's kind of not the case. These guys, by the way, were like 10, 12,000 makes sense because they were separated in two principal divisions. So more or less this several thousands per each does make sense, even as a sort of two sort of separated armies, not even battle lines. One was called the French companies, and the reason being that these forces were made up of specifically French mercenaries hired for the expedition under d'Audorem. The other one was known as the Grand Compagnie, so the Great Companies, which was a more multinational congerie of, in fact, what was really the times of it at the peak of, at this point, of the free companies in Europe. These guys were actually sent away from France because they had been ravaging the same country. Again, I study the free companies in part, especially in the 40s, actually, of the 14th century, not here, but it makes, like, it was completely normal, right, to hire these companies, maybe just fight against one power. Then this company, say the campaign is over, you simply disband these guys. They do not know what to do, and both powers sort of, or even the ones against which they had been used, basically hired them and sent them, in this case, to Spain, right? It's completely normal. It had always been existing, also between France and like it was the Angevins and the Aragonese in the wars of the Sicilian Vespers. With the Almogavares, the same thing had happened. No hard feelings. The same French hired the Catalan mercenaries, and the composition of these units was also much more heterogeneous. Sometimes you see we use certain nationalities, like saying again the Normans, whatever, as a synecdoche rather than anything. These companies that the French employ in Castile are, by the way, mostly of the heavy type that was dominant in Western Europe at the time. I'm talking properly men-at-arms as the core of. These are not bands of lighter troops. Or at least they're not. They're always like the backbone is always men-at-arms, even if these are accompanied, of course, by some lighter forces. But they are mostly, like, in fact, coming, as we will see now, from Western Europe broadly, and so not from areas that were based, in fact, on that pretty heavy standard of the Western men-at-arms. On the march, these two divisions were subdivided into units not greater than 200 strong, some sort of companies. It was absolutely normal, and so these two contingents represent like something pretty flexible. It could be deployed either in a single or in double battle line, and you had these companies that could also have different tactical employments, like, I don't know, flank attack in the reserves, or just they were the most important tactically active unit of the battle line in the first place. These companies were commanded, of course, by each one their own captain, as it was completely normal. Again, when we talk companies, at this point what we're talking about, especially from the 13th century, they would become the standard for European warfare until the 17th, right? The mercenary forces, like a few hundred men strong, just being the most tactically dynamic force fielded in usually what would later become a regiment as the main tactical unit on the field, one commanded by a single superior officer, very, very tactically homogeneous in Western Europe, except for a few, again, fringe peoples we will see here and there. Now, the interesting fact about this force is that each captain of these companies was accompanied by an Aragonese knight, which was a form of political involvement of Peter of Aragon in this Iberian affair. That was the most, the insider authority, but point of reference also for logistical support operationally from the same peninsula. There is a Castilian document that describes these French and other foreign forces as, quote, very great companies of, in fact, here it lists the nationality: Frenchmen, Englishmen, Germans, Bretons, Limousins, and Gascons. Froissart calls them Frenchmen, Bretons, Englishmen, Normans, Picards, and Burgundians. The latter has more of a French bias, and again, Froissart wrote at different times of his life, like, to please different type of readers. But in general, like, these were plausible nationalities from which these guys would fundamentally come from. So you see the northern France, England, the broader Germany, Brittany, Aquitaine, Gascony, right? So also lands that were actually bordering Castile. Here there is all a political background that and further connection, even logistically, from France, the Atlantic coast, etc. But this is not important. The important being having tens of thousands of, essentially, a French, like a foreign army in your own territory to win the throne with your faction for greater reasons of affecting international coordination that already show how much Spain was fully part of Western politics and warfare. By 1367, other 10,000 so-called companions, this was the term to define the soldiers because they were organized in companies, that's the reason, were brought into Castile. Right. This situation had, however, changed also because of the 100 Years' War. You have the English and Gascons under Edward of Woodstock, the Black Prince. I made a video about the Battle of Poitiers that is one of the most beautiful ones, honestly, I've ever studied for medieval warfare, the masterpiece of the Black Prince, as a matter of fact, which shows you how these guys specifically would have been fighting just on a regular basis. The English at this point were backing the exiled Don Pedro, that had in fact been successfully ousted by the French-backed bastard brother Henry. In spite of the English victory at the Battle of Naja in the same 1367, Henry and his French supporters finally won the war. This brought to, in fact, particularly long French-Castilian partnership until the beginning of the 15th century. In fact, we know that French soldiers remained strongly present in Castile until the 90s of the 14th century. This shows you also the degree of, again, entrepreneurship of warfare, how it was being managed even by a power like France, that was in need of forces for, say, the 100 Years' War on its own soil. Of course, part of these forces were financed, as we've seen, also by other countries, and the same Castile that recovered a unity, a cohesion, also thanks, in fact, to this, again, military instrument of politics, to speak Clausewitzianly. All right. We know that in 1372 there were at least 1,000 French men-at-arms in Castile under their commander Pierre Lebec de Villaine. For 1385, Froissart writes that there were 2,000 knights and squires from Gascony, Burgundy, France here intended, of course, in the narrower northeastern French sense in modern terms. In fact, Picards that are separated from the same part, and Bretons. At the Battle of Aljubarrota, we will talk about all these battles because they're really important. The cycle will, provide them to us in at least as the choice. Then, of course, I have stockpiling massive amount of sources and resources and other material to immediately deliver you, like the single most critically advanced form of military historical analysis on these engagements, right? From the single most updated historiography, but more and especially from my own personal take on the actually primary sources. And that's always the single most important thing for any serious strategic inquiry. There are other sources, specifically, in fact, about Aljubarrota, saying that the French had there something between 1,500 to 800 men-at-arms, which always counts for other, at least, field aids and or properly fighting forces in just next to them on the battlefield. In 1386, we know of 1,500, 1,000 French men-at-arms, again assisting John I of Castile during the invasion carried out by the country carried out by the Duke of Lancaster. We told this in some of our videos on, in fact, medieval Iberia. We know of other 2,000 under Guillaume de Naillac and Gauthier de Passac raised in 1387, or at least being raised in 1387. This is important because it shows how they operated. They had specific captains in Castile to hire troops from their autonomies, right? The way they would be paid changed. Part of these guys were financed by their own crown, others by the local one. there was, generally speaking, a business about these companies, say, availability, and so the general political and strategical interests would know how to make good use of these. The English had remained active in Spain as well. They were fighting, for example, alongside Navarre against Castile. They were at the side of the Aragonese against the same opponent. In the 80s, they back Portugal, the 80s of the 14th century. For example, in 1381-82, you have Edmund Langley, that was the Earl of Cambridge, leading 1,500 men-at-arms and 1,500 archers. These were, say, mostly English, right? But they included also Gascons, which would be normal considering at least the English control of that French region, but also Castilian exiles themselves. And this sort of makes sense because, of course, of the specificities of that war, right? These guys would have been hired as others that were present in Spain, also because of their individual political weight at some point. So you have, in this case, instead a typically English indenture, right? Even just by organic proportions, 1,500 men-at-arms, 1,500 presumably longbowmen by standard at this point. We have the aforementioned contingent led by the Earl of Cambridge during the invasion of Castile alongside the Portuguese, right? We know also of 400 to 800 English archers under 3 squires in the Portuguese force at Aljubarrota. The largest English expeditionary force was that of 1386-87. At this point, the Duke of Lancaster was pressing his own claim essentially to the throne of Castile, so he invaded Galicia, Leon, in alliance with Portugal, and he had as many as 2,000 men-at-arms, 3,000 archers, and maybe other 2,000 infantry. This is a sizable force, especially for the initiative of the Duke of Lancaster, the general. I mean the English capacity of just shipping these forces in a foreign land. This Anglo-French presence, as you understand, does influence significantly the way the Iberian monarchs start looking at these forces and saying, we should essentially imitate at least the most updated forms of organization, of armament, in a broader sense for our emerging monarchical statal forces, right? That were, as we will see, because we talk a lot about the first permanent armies with France, with Italy. The same thing was happening in Spain. And so the question was, it was unprecedented. And given that there wasn't even just like necessarily a progress intentionality, the idea was like, these are the companies that fight in Europe, right? We have employed them, we know how they work, we have the men, we have the money, let's just essentially recreate these forces on our own in the ways that, of course, are more suitable to us. Of course, for example, the organics would be different, as we'll see. That the Spanish would maintain the jinetes, for example, that most of these forces didn't really have. There were actually some mounted archers, as we will see now, but there is some, again, typical Iberian character otherwise. The process of Iberian imitation of Anglo-French forces would soon unfold. For example, as early as 1372, King Ferdinand of Portugal stipulated that his vassals in future like expected to field soldiers equipped either in the French or the English way, right? This is not meant as a particular type of panoply in a, say, national style, but in the way they would like homogenize their own armament. And of course, like, again, European arms and armor at this point are pretty similar to one another. There are local variations, but the idea is how standardized they have to be, right, to appear in, like, to show up when the armies were gathered, right? There was a full reorganization in 1382 when both Castile and Portugal laid down new rules for raising and administrating their armies. King Ferdinand of Portugal, for example, abolished the entire Moorish military nomenclature that had been used for centuries in his realm, or what was actually before even the creation of the kingdom, and replaced it with the current Anglo-French terminology of his allies. This is important because already from centuries, actually, most of Western Europe had maintained, had been about, French-derived sort of military vocabulary. There were important local variations, but they had always stemmed from mostly that sort of post-Carolingian reality, right? And they stem from all, also essentially Latin terminology. At least in the Moorish-dominated parts of Spain, it's not much that the local language spoken was not Romance, but the fact that the actual forms of military organization that had existed during the Islamic period had in part been maintained. There were lots of Muslims and Jews that were regularly employed by the Iberian monarchies because simply they could not be diluted. They were a vast minority, meaning that they were a quite consistent one, and it would take, again, important level of persecution, expulsion, forced conversion later on to fully, homogenize things. But this process of westernization was passing in from what seemed like a, maybe a banality, like changing the names of the actual, for example, commanders. The term Alferez Mor, which stood for Chief Standard Bearer, was transformed into Constable, the Condestable, as it was, made it the Iberian way. Also term Maréchal or Marechal was employed. So all terms that derived from the Frankish military vocabulary used, especially by the French and the English, that especially in Portugal and Castile, were the sort of closest at hand, military forces that could bring these foreign influences. John I of Castile replaced similarly the office of Alferez del Rey with that of Constable. This was specifically like a French change rather than the English one. He also appointed not one marshal but two. Naturally, however, these military changes were not just terminological, and in fact it's more difficult as it is just for the reconstruction of the general developments of armies at this point in history, to assess what they consisted practically in, like how these changes would eventually concretize, especially in the way the troops were levied, trained, equipped, and also operated on the field. It's not just about organic, that would also adapt to certain different circumstances historically. But we do not know everything we would like to on how these armies really were. Like this is the general awareness that it tries to spread among people. It's not much about the fact that we can't reconstruct with these armies, and the importance in realizing, in fact, the limits of this, but also in the fact that there is a positive way to it anyway, right? People often say, well, we do not know, as largely in some cases, not always, because sometimes just that they do not know how things really work. In some cases, these things must be researched specifically, which has not been done historiographically. But the fact that even when you do not know certain things, because somebody has not published them in the first place, there are ways, in fact, to find out, right? And there is especially an analogical method that is risky, but in a military logical sense, like kind of works, right? My impression, in fact, as we'll see now, is that there weren't radical differences with the rest of Western Europe, but the ones that existed, of course, speak of also specific political and social factors that characterize the Iberian Peninsula. We do have, however, some important source, and of course this is a period in history that I imagine being researched, or at least being, say, if not adequately, say there is plenty, right, of room for further study. In 1385, but sometimes you see even the other sources cited to 1390, John the First of Castile issued an ordinance of arms. It was quite resembling the 13th century statutes and assizes of England and France. All right, I made a video, one of the early ones, on the medieval English army organization. We have seen what the assize of arms was. This 1385 Castilian ordinance is the first kind of statute and assize fundamentally known for Spain. Of course, there was something equivalent before this, because essentially authorities had to take care of the levies standards being high enough to be, of course, sent to the military expeditions. Was also a political, primarily actually, a political occasion to test the, let's say, loyalty of the vassals, of the broader population to the monarchic cause. In fact, these gatherings were, let's say, required to all the able-bodied men from 20 to 60 years old. We have, as always, some dissonant source for a SAR for 1384 tells us that Saint John the First of Castile summoned to Seville all the men from 15 to 60 years of age, raising 60,000 thereby. These forces would have, by the way, never been sent to a campaign as such, right? Armies, again, still at this time, were fairly small. We will see what the maximum was, and the main aim was to provide like a contained but quite costly and efficient amount of men-at-arms that would maintain the professional standards needed for the time. In fact, quite, as we've seen, dynamic and specialized way of war that was materializing like after the crisis was ever more, in fact, heavily based on the assets that the various European states could invest in these quite bulky, solid forces. But mastering troops was still a way to, again, check their availability in times of need and emergency, because as we've seen also for the previous centuries in other videos, there were constant political strives in these countries. So even relying on a levy militia was important for the control of a particular province, and these guys could be mobilized depending on the circumstances. This is the reason why musters were to be held every 2 months under John, and the main purpose of it was equipment checking. Right, this was the main. We've seen it also in the video about the Scottish pikemen. There is really a standard now that is issued and regularized across Europe throughout this masters. It had always been there. There had always been some authority at the local level checking whether the eligible levies were fit for military service. This was at some levels intensified and or at least homogenized, like it was made sure that this would work in this enormous realms, right, in a way that wouldn't leave some gap, right, some vacuum, which also like a royal authority could not be heard. Again, it's mostly a political need. It's not that these troops were literally fielded eventually just because they had to muster. But the political and military turmoils of the time were also obliging the local communities just to keep themselves in a way or another, right? So this fact, especially that every able-bodied man, from like the youth to the elderly, was in theory eligible for service. It was something very old, right? It dated back since ever, like to just it had been dismissed because largely it was firstly a feudal and then now de facto mercenary army that was carrying out most of the operations required by these great powers. But the cooperation of the local communities was always there. It was just a chance to promote even the local community in front of the king. Because if you show yourself to be fit, say resourceful, motivated, you could be maybe actually co-opted and rewarded. And so this maybe was a gateway to some sort of political privilege or sort. Even though, again, as we'll see now better, this military reforms entailed mostly a nobiliar centrality, so that they did not correspond to remilitarization of these communities. It was just like, if anything, checking if they were to do their theoretical job and just rising a little bit more the available resources in a sort of more uniform and reliable way, right? The same ordinance of arms took measures to try and halt a steady increase in the substitution of mules for horses, which was a particularly frustrated trend, rightfully identified by the royal authority as severely detrimental to the effectiveness of the kingdom's cavalry. And this is not to be taken seriously, like it seems like a joke, but really, like before we talk about the Castilian Civil War, the same Henry of Trastamara had ridden at the Battle of Nájera a, quote, strong mule, not a war horse, right? So, I don't know here about, we will see that there was actually plenty of horses, especially in the nobility estates, and there would even be a tendency of Iberian cavalry to remain pretty light compared to the Western one in general, as it had always been the case in Iberian history. But this thing of mules brought at the master in lieu of horses is a pretty serious problem, because in a warfare based on the decisiveness of the mounted arm, especially in the second half of the 14th century, had even increased in power compared to a couple of generations before. And in fact, as always, I always stress, there was not a linear increase in infantry power during the late Middle Ages. It's just more like a general trend. But the mules are not horses. You can't fight, of course, in the same way. And in part, it would be just legitimately people being too poor and trying this, like, okay, well, let's try to corrupt the master officer, official or something. At other times, you realize that there were some structural, systemic problems, and this is what I was referring to at the beginning, that, of course, aside from the different traditional levy systems, it was some, like, I have never heard of this in the rest of European warfare, like horses were to be found in a word and are more or less performing whatever, but the mules, right? Instead of the war horse, it's something else. By the way, the same ordinance, still 1385, demanded that each man should serve with the following equipment depending on his yearly income. So a typical recruitment law, which counts in maravedis. Now the maravedi was a coin minted in Castile from the end of the 12th century. It was based on the Almoravid gold morabitin, right? And it actually had, if I'm correct, stopped being minted as early as 1221, but as a name, it sort of remained as the standard Castilian money of account. I mean, still in the modern age, the maravedis, you find them in general, like they were not like important like florins, ducats, etc. In fact, we will see now that they are pretty many. In fact, they were what you would expect even in this very detailed recruitment law to identify like the individual type of equipment. Then, starting from the most affluent class, 20,000 plus maravedis entailed the provision of a horse, a harness, an auberge, coat of plates, gambeson, leg and arm harness, bassinet with camel and capellina plus gorget or helm, sword, dagger, lance, and axe. Right, this is a full-fledged, ultra-heavy man-at-arm on horseback, and it's indeed a very expensive equipment. Right, so this gives you sort of an idea, proportion also how much 20,000 maravedis were about. This is the elite. Right, and it's really a complete, again, we are in the end of the 14th century here, you see there is a already the reference to the coat of plates, so the gambas and all the various leg and arm harness that had been diversifying for quite a while. The helmet with cameo, quite interestingly, and even as a secondary weapon, not just you have the lance, the sword, but an axe, right, which is actually quite. It would be normal, like we consider often, like just the sword and the lance ideally, but men at arms had normally all kind of side weapons. Here you have the axe, the dagger. Like the axe was, especially in this, in fact, starting to be consistently plated type of combat, like necessary to shatter properly the various plates from one another, right, and then operating in a more surgical way with the sword, the dagger. And so the swords were actually turning to be a bit more like with the same functionality, but still they retain an important cutting capacity rather than the bludgeoning one that these other axes, warhammers, etc., would at least specifically develop for. Then from 3,000 to 20,000 maravedis, you would need to go to war with a horse, an aubergine, gambesson, bassinet without cameo, capellina, sword, estoc, knife, lance, javelin, and shield. So here, essentially, you have to go to war with a gambesson and some sort of coat of mail, and especially protecting the upper part of the chest. The bassinet is without cameo. You have another sort of add protection underneath. Here, what is interesting is that you have a differentiation from the smaller side weapons. You have not a dagger, but an estoc. You have a knife that is coming around as like something lighter than or something between actually the dagger and the estoc. Here I don't have the original language, so it would be interesting actually to understand exactly what they were thinking and what kind of terms they used to define which kind of weapons, because it's not all like we are in pre-Linean times, so they can't be so precise. The other interesting thing is that the heaviest class, did not have to provide a shield, because the coat of plates would do for it. That's the actual explanation. But especially that this second class had to use a javelin. So this is actually a heavy cavalryman, but he has to use also missile weapon, which is quite fascinating because, yes, this is not the ultra elite, but the javelin normally is not like that common in Western Europe anymore, at least for fringe areas like, I don't know, the Celtic one, or maybe Gascony, think about the Bidot, etc. But this is a heavy cavalryman fundamentally. You would have, surely by the end of the 14th century, you know that warfare was becoming ever heavier, and at this point even a sword proportionally, like for the industrial capacity and the socio-economical dynamics, and also just the way these guys were normally hired and equipped by someone else, was not so, and paid, if anything, by someone else, because they would also buy their own equipment with that salary. They would afford a sword normally, etc. So during the 100 Years' War, you see, for example, mounted bowmen or crossbowmen. Here you see instead what would be the jinnete of some sort, right? Also because here the second class is the last one that requires a horse, which, by the way, doesn't mean that even the lower classes could have not been actually fighting mounted. It is likely by some extent. Just the way, again, these are just recruitment laws. We're full of these, But what the army on the field would look like also after, I don't know, 2 months of campaign is something very different, right? So the way eventually, like, you can't simply judge. Here you lack even just some. It's a general patrimonial law. Yes, it tells you what you should be equipped like, so it shows you like a tactical segmentation of sort. But what about the proportions? It's say at a lower level, for example, how many troops would it was just like a direct proportionality of the quantity. This is not to be said. What about the attrition rate? Also of the same equipment, for example. But the third class here is from 2 to 3,000 maravedis. It requires a bassinet or capellina, alternatively, shield, spear, knife, and sword or oar estoc. So this is essentially heavy infantry. Then from 600 to 2,000 maravedis, crossbow with nut, cord and stirrup, belt and quiver containing 3 dozen bolts. These are instead missile troops. And this is interesting because the lower classes we'll see now are still sort of heavy infantry in the sense that they're not missile, or at least they're partly missile, but they can engage into hand-to-hand combat. And this is also fascinating because in other countries it's not quite like this. Like the lower type of soldiers, it's a heavy soldier of some sort. Like it doesn't have javelin especially, because let's read it. It's from 400 to 600 maravedis, spear, javelin, and shield, and less than 400 maravedis, spear and javelin. All right. So the difference is the shield in the upper class, and for the rest you have a spear that is also mentioned before the javelin. So we realize that these guys were not. You can't call them light infantry. They're technically heavies in the sense that they can stand their ground. Something that a crossbowman from the 600 to 2,000 maravedis class can't, because he's just literally equipped with the crossbow, and this doesn't mean that he could not have a side weapon of some sort. This is also just what they issued, right? And in that case, with a crossbow, with all those characteristics, 3 dozen bolts, etc., it's a very specific requirement that is what the legislator is interested in just having readily available when these troops are levied, right? So this is the interesting part of the story, that eventually how these guys would be employed is not told, of course, by these kind of laws. It's normal, right? You have to go a bit beyond. You just have a general idea of what these troops look like. And you immediately understand that in Spain there is, essentially differently from the rest of Western Europe, a lower strata of troops that is sort of skirmishing. Right, here we are in Castille, so it's not that like we're confined to some area of the Pyrenees or whatever. It's just like the entirety of the realm, and still this skirmishing way of war, even with the technical end of the Reconquista, which is in the 13th century, not really in 1492. Of course, there was lots of other warfare going on, even with the same Muslims, but at least those had fundamentally accepted Christian suzerainty, and so that's when, after Las Navas, technically the Reconquista ended. All right. So, of course, Castile, especially what we've seen it in other videos, had this more feudal backbone. There were many areas that were like about cattle breeders. Like there wasn't even just like the same level of urbanization of the of Aragon, of Catalonia, saying better, because Aragon was pretty similar in that regard as well in the interland. But in general, like, people would know even how just to handle a javelin, which is not what. Yes, I mean, it's not extremely complicated, but here there are also relatively cheap troops. But the way these sort of hit and run tactics, this raiding warfare, skirmishing capacities, were sort of more accentuated just in the Iberian Peninsula because of how the local communities had developed. This is not something you find in France or England or Italy, or like there are fringe areas. Javelins are used, especially in siege warfare. They're very effective against armor, but there are also kinds and kinds of javelin. So this levy mostly relied on men-at-arms, crossbowmen, which is also very, very typical of the second half of the 14th century, because it's as if by the mid 14th century, the larger heavy infantry units had sort of melted away, and just the specialized professionals, the men-at-arms and the crossbowmen, had remained in at least as the core of the army. All right, the rest were troops aggregated in the ways we will see also better now. They were lighter and not too effective. I made a video, by the way, recently about Castilian slingers, exactly during the 14th century, so if you're interested, you can check that out. This 1385 Ordinance of Arms naturally was not the only document that we had. There were really veritable reforms following further, close sequence. In 1390, we have a pretty interesting decision taken in Castile, as the royal army fixed actually a maximum of troops that could be raised. Right? This is not really a demand, meaning that there was an explosion of forces available. Quite the contrary, it was rather the declaration that in fact more than these troops the king could not properly ask. Right? So it was, even as a decision, like some intervention, naturally was negotiated with the Castilian estates. Right? I made some videos about how Castilian politics worked at this point. It sort of makes sense. So this roof was essentially 4,000 men-at-arms, 1,500 jinetes, and 1,000 mounted archers. Right? There were similar provisions for Portugal, also for the composition of the troops, and in Portuguese sources, like the jinete is spelled with G, not with the J. Initially, jinete is Jinetes. This composition is sort of telling of what we were just speaking of before. Essentially, you have a core, even a majority one altogether, of 4,000 men-at-arms, then 1,500 de facto mounted skirmishers, mounted javeliners, and 1,000 mounted archers. If you look at the 1385 Ordinance, you realize, like this, from the segmentation of the recruitment classes, that there is a bulk of men-at-arms that have to have this greater equipment, and then you find all these javelins and the crossbowmen. Even now, the mounted archers would be also literal archers, not crossbowmen, but these roles were sort of, if not exchangeable, like something comparable. All right. Naturally, this roof seems designed mostly for having an effective core of the royal army, so that habitually, like if there was a war going on, of course the local communities were involved to the point that, I don't know, the local city militias would provide with their own contingents. So it's not, at this point the Castilians did not use infantry in their own field armies, but the core, like what the king wanted to ensure himself as a maximum, by the way, was this 4,000 men-at-arms, a very heavy core, but still something again that you do not essentially see proportionally in Western Europe. This fundamentally light cavalrymen, like that, are quite typical also of Iberian warfare during the Reconquista, right, and having to do with the military tactics of hit and run that had characterized the country. This issue was, as we were saying, the proof of the failure or refusal of the king's vassals to provide a larger amount of troops, right? The normal standard for a lord at the time was to have a retinue, right? The mesnatas, as they were called, is a term, very old term that may derive from the machinata, the grinded flour that was essentially the primal food of the late antique, early medieval Romano-Germanic housemen, say, that lived with the lord in his mansion, right, as retinues / bodyguard. In feudal times, the retinues had been maintained. Technically, the 13th century companies that we start seeing again also ever more on the market of warfare are sometimes the literal expansion of that eventually the lord makes ever more of a business, as essentially many lower aristocrats were impoverished by the crisis, by the strengthening of the higher nobility, and they were much more involved, still much more involved in warfare. This is a trend that would go on until the 18th century. We witnessed it for many countries. And of course, the military service had always been an object of content. There had been some historical limits, etc. We will see it better in another video for, say, high medieval Spain. So this was already history in many ways. And eventually these guys would use these retinues for their own private wars, for that matter. But the costs, if you look at them materially, they were really prohibitive at some point. We've seen there the problem with the mules as opposed to the horses. Then, as we were recalling before, there were also other communities that had to be solicited to provide their own forces. The towns that usually were actually still under the noblemen, some lord that had the task, in fact, of drilling the local town militias and going at war for the king, because in theory, at least in the Romano-Germanic tradition, the king would have just had the right to mobilize every single person in the realm. The problem was how politically real it could be. So of course you have all these different types of different layers, right, of mobilization, and ideal rights are still there, but in reality you always have a negotiated outcome. And practically how the 1390 and also the later issues would work for the reform, let's say, of the Castilian army, as well as in the rest of Iberia, really, were based on money thieves, right? Essentially, we've seen how mercenaries, soldiers of fortune, had become a bit like the gold standard of the European armed forces. These were still noblemen on their own. It's just that they would say that monetary economy had rendered the hiring and the let's say the availability of these troops a much more international and professional thing, also much more technical, more specialized one. So you couldn't really, especially after the 14th century crisis, the Black Death, etc., simply force the peasantry into warfare equipment. No, right? This couldn't even be done, as we've seen for the lords that commanded them to some extent. So how you would actually incentivize, this is a European-wide history, it's not just about Spain really, was to grant money fiefs, that is to say a certain amount of revenue from a specific community. The term in Spanish would be either acostamientos or tierras, that were in fact not necessarily even the places from which the troops were to come from, right? Simply the recipients were just expected to hold themselves ready for military service. In part, this would come from, you see, there was a correspondence sometimes, like of the money fief to the lord who control a certain land for which he already owed military service in the feudal law, right? So the money fief was not like a canceling of feudal obligations, right? But this could come simply from, I don't know, our land makes so much money, so on the base of that we will hire the equivalent troops like we want to, we are issued mostly, and so you have an annual retainer plus wages when on active service, and the system works mostly like this. Again, this was stemming from the fact, as we were saying before, that the higher nobility had become disproportionately wealthy throughout the previous generations, and so these guys were just, like, because of their wealth, expected to be able to afford a certain amount of troops. And again, it was not about the quantity but the quality, right? And this was also a mean of political promotion, social enhancement, and so on, right? The Admiral of Castile, for example, was given 142,500 maravedis per year in the 1390 Ordinance. That equated to the service of 95 lances. So if you count that, it's 1,500 maravedis per lance. So when we talk about the lance, however, we have to pay attention, because Spain did not have the same type of Western organization as far as the lance was concerned. This was we never made video about this specifically, but it varied also in other parts of Europe, but it typically was from 2 to 6 men in a unit. Like, you have the men at arms and a certain amount of retainers that were actually, fighters in part, other just field aides, right? The only place in the Iberian Peninsula where the lance system was standing was Navarre, because and also other parts actually, that depends on the single lords and whether they wanted to arrange their troops like that, depending on their autonomy as well. In the extreme north, because of French influence, right? Otherwise, the lance, like in the rest of Western Europe, did not exist in Spain. It was properly unknown, right? The term lance would still in Spanish identify the single horseman, after which, in fact, the concept of lance was also as a unit was evolving from. The other one was barbuta, for example, took name from the helmet. All right, we'll talk about this. There are famous things, and again, conceptually, that was just like in the tank, like the basis of the commander, right? Except it's also the gunner because of the smashing force. But the Spanish didn't have the same organic tendency. This would be interesting to analyze, to inquire as well, like why this wouldn't happen. It's in part the same reason why we're witnessing these kind of reforms. Again, there wasn't such relentless need to uniform and to properly organize the Iberian forces maybe it was a matter of internal market that functioned differently from the one of the rest of Western Europe. We do not know, right? Likely things worked much more similarly than we think, but at least these formalities differed, right? In 1429, we know that almost 1/4 of the Castilian crown's regular income was anticipated just to be spent on paying out the money thieves, the tierras, for over 9,000 lances, which doesn't mean, again, that they could or would be fielded that quickly or easily. These are just the money that are essentially put one side and say, okay, this is what we can spend on the lances. But again, no army at that point really had something like 9,000 lances available in a single army. In fact, in 1432, you have the broader estimation of 10,000 lances available on the basis of the money. You see, in the entirety of Castile, there would have been even more than 10,000 eligible lances if you consider all the people you can mobilize in theory. But again, the practice is a completely different story. You could even hire troops from abroad, as we've seen, but this doesn't mean that you could simply field them operationally, logistically, or tactically. Like it's an enormous number, and we've seen that, again, it's not the quantity really that matters as much as the quality. All these reforms, together with the roof that we exemplified for the early period, were all a struggle between the monarchy and the kingdom's estates to centralize, or say decentralize further. We've seen that, of course, especially in Castile, that is in fact the country here that is the strongest and mobilizing more forces. Routinely, the monarchy would develop in a very sound way. There were lots of sort of civil strifes, but mostly connected with the fact that the nobility was also very powerful, and that was becoming ever more co-opted as being part of almost the same monarchic entourage, right? But this meant as well that next to the royal armies, and as a hybrid of the same, because again, this king or pretendant to the throne or whatever would fight supported with a nobiliar faction or another, were sided by powerful nobiliar forces, right? We see, for example, that in the same 1390, royal lands were granted to the nobility in the return for the service of 2,300 lances, which meant, in that particular case, that the market did not have functional enough control on that specific territory to just have it more efficient to recruit troops on their own. Also because the local nobility would essentially prevent them from doing so. They wouldn't provide the manpower or general resources, right? So they kept asking it to the monarchy kept asking it directly to the noblemen, like in the old way. And right up until the end of the 15th century, you can see massive armies fielded by the nobility. For example, the Duke of Medina Sidonia raised 4,000 cavalry from Seville. Right, Seville, okay, with a big city, but it's the ducal power here involved that is remarkable. Another was levied in the same way from Andalusian towns in 1468. In 1489, the greater noblemen of Castile raised 7,461 cavalry and 5,795 infantry in an army in which the two arms would have counted respectively 13,000 and 40,000, which is a massive force that for those years, like we're being gathered now by the Spanish, it's a very, again, also things changed during the 15th century towards a much more developed situation, but it tells you that nobility power was that still enterprising, like as private forces they could essentially make for some of the, say, the finest part of the royal army as a kingdom's army as a whole, right? Nobiliar forces fought either under their own lord, the seigneur, or his appointed deputy, given that these oligarchs were just like in control of veritable states within the state, considering their assets, their estates, right? In Spain, notoriously, the church had an immense power, so that, albeit less militarized than the laymen, we can see the archbishops of Toledo and Santiago rising in the 15th century, 300 cavalry and 3,000 infantry. In 1483, the bishops, the military orders, and the greater nobility all together gathered 4,700 cavalry and 3,440 infantry, which again, especially in the number of cavalry, it's really fascinating, and it shows in that regard how much they could afford just on integrating this cavalry with even, say, infantry formations that they would know they would find out there, and not just needing to mobilize on their own. Naturally, here again, we are at the end of the 15th century. Spain is a much more compact ensemble, and it's much more interconnected, so moving back and forth across the peninsula is still challenging, but it's also like much more feasible than it had ever been with those forces, and nobility power is simply reflected by this as well. Were we to talk properly about the army the kings could levy from their royal demand, we have a fine, small, permanent nucleus of cavalry. Right, this was essentially similar to the one we saw before. You have the men-at-arms and the jinetes. This force is ready to intervene across the country, being supported by the local communities logistically, but also strategically. Under John II, this is still about Castile, of course. John II, we are from 1406, 1454, right? You have 1,000 lances at the service of the Castilian crown, maintained at a cost, however, of over 7 million maravedis a year. All right, this tells you how also hyper elite these forces were, how they could afford some of the finest armament of the time. John's son Henry IV, who ruled after his father's demise until 1474, seems to have increased further this force to 3,600 lances. This naturally was going in parallel with the sort of increasing again, availability of resources. Also, like the early number is apparently contained. If it wasn't for the cost, it is enormous. So what essentially here the monarchy was invested on was on an elite force they were, however, sure to be able to integrate through the regular ordinances with an effective effective army, right? Where just 1,000 lances, but again, as a number, it's not even just too few. The Reyes Catholicus, Isabella and Ferdinand, maintained in their time still a similar number of troops. You have the Guardas Reales, royal guards of around 900 lances. Then you have the troops paid by the Hermandad that were essentially like the Holy Brotherhood, the confederation of cities leagued together for the defense of their liberty, sort of again a town league against civil disorder, a bit like the Landfried in Germany. But they would at this point support the crown, of course, for the same sake, right? The towns as a whole did not have too much power, except like the monarchs would invest in them to counterbalance the nobility. This was, of course, the strategy. Their mandate provided for something like 1,400 to 1,500 lances, at least paid for. This is also the important side of the story. The monarch would get this money, and then they would hire their own troops. Then there was a troop of royal vassals drawn from the lesser nobility and paid by the king. We're talking 1067 lances in 1489. So again, it's roughly around 4,000, right? And despite the availability of resources of the various armies, the Castilian and the Portuguese ones remain, as you see, relatively contained, right? Aside from the different ways these military organizations were adjusted, developed, etc., when you look at the overall size of the Castilian and Portuguese armies during the 14th and 15th century, you realize that, especially at the core of the men-at-arms base, they were pretty much as big as other, again, regional powers of the time, right? For example, Castile fielding customarily from 5,000 to 6,000 men-at-arms during the 14th century is actually pretty large. It's how much France did, it's how much Milan did. So these were actually the largest forces in the West. In this sense, they may have been underplayed. I found a scholar even saying, but the Castilian armies were small during this time. Are you kidding me? Like 5,000 to 6,000 men-at-arms, literally the roof, the top that can be filled. Talking actual heavies here, not, say, a corps of heavies and just 5,000-6,000 troops in total, plus as I was saying before, even if the concept of lances did not exist in Spain, doesn't mean that the lances that were known as the single men-at-arms would not actually be followed, in fact, by other troops in the retinue, as like it wouldn't make any sense, telling the truth. You have also a varying number of jinetes, as we've seen, actually smaller in the early phase. Then later, this is not entirely clear to me. I think nobody has ever made a serious statistical research about this, but it is true, as we've seen before, that at least in theory, the troops that the monarchy especially wanted to just have available counted more men-at-arms than jinetes. It's a concept that we can see transmuted, for example, as we've seen from the English side of the story, as many longbowmen as men-at-arms in some of the forces that operated in Spain, even though normally, like this we'll see also for the same English armies, it varied in in proportion as well. The longbowmen can be also many more. Right, as we will see, the jinetes actually could really be there. There were for Castile 1,200 jinetes in the invasion of Gascony of 1374, 1,500 against the Earl of Cambridge in 1382, 1,000 at the siege of Lisbon of 1384, 2,000 at Aljubarrota. The largest number is given by Chandos Herald, claiming their presence at the Battle of Nayara, but we have varying sources. One says, in fact, 4,000, another 12,000, so it's not entirely clear. Consider that when, especially French, English sources are speaking of like a relatively faraway land like Spain, they tended to say, always to exaggerate sometimes, or not to be so precise. This is really typical if you read Western chronicles in general. Like if it is local, the number is actually always very accurate, in spite of what people think about chronicles in general. If they start talking about the Turks in Cavalry or whatever, they start saying, I don't know, they had 200,000 horsemen or whatever. That's at the limit of some novel, or of some fable rather than else. You have to be careful, of course. The infantry is yet another interesting topic, because Spain did have a tradition of foot troops of some relevance, especially the ones connected with the cities that today we do not look at in detail. But we're not talking about just infantry, like there were, for example, the Caballeros Villanos as well. There were some interesting, militias organized there. We have different examples. 5,000 archers in the Gascon expedition of 1374 that we just numbered. For Nayara, that is sort of very, again here the numbers are a bit just also the larger, normally the ones about the infantry are less precise than the ones about cavalry, but here we have even 50,000, including 6,000 crossbowmen. This is unrealistic. I mean, the crossbowman is surely a more realistic figure than the rest, but it wouldn't even be a need to have 50,000 infantry. These are just figures thrown a bit like this. For that element of the army it was less relevant after all, and Nayar was such a big battle, so everybody had to magnify it to some extent. So here we're just giving some number. We're not making statistical observations, because we should pick literally all the sources. We'll give any figure and associate, comparing this with cavalry, trying to construct the array, whatever. It's something we'll best do in the videos probably about the battles, the single battles. The Portuguese had a bit of a less power as expected than the Castilians. They normally fielded something like 2,000 to 3,000 men-at-arms in the 14th century. It's not few, telling the truth. Infantry seems to have been also in the norm, like something between 10,000 to 12,000. I made a video about the Battle of Toro, and there we documented something, at least one figure is 5,600 cavalry, 14,000 infantry. Again, check out the videos, one of my re-uploads, and it's an interesting battle. Alright, the Castilians on that occasion, in 1476, so it's basically the year after, have 4,000 men-at-arms, 8,000 jinetes, and 30,000 infantry. All right, and it's sort of big number, especially this. Normally, Western Europeans would have similar numbers in terms of multiple thousands of men-at-arms, and then 3-4 times the same amount of infantry. So yes, sometimes even more, like in the tens of thousands, just like in this case, depending on what kind of support they obtain, especially if they were larger armies, like 5,000-6,000 men-at-arms. But the difference here with the Iberian organic is this large numbers of jinetes, right, that are a bit difficult to frame even in the recruitment classes that we've seen before, at least in the availability, because they are still cavalry, right? It doesn't matter whether they're light, and some of them can also, of course, perform significant hand-to-hand combat duties. So it's true that there are javeliners that we haven't seen elsewhere in Europe, so it's possible that in this proportion this would be just mounted javeliners or something. Would dismount and be part of the infantry? We still need, as we've seen, all the cavalry, tires, etc. So it's a considerably large force. We saw it in other engagements. For example, the Battle of Rio Salado, in which the jinetes were likely like the lighter elements, even sort of comparable to the more specialistic crossbowmen in the rest of Western warfare, stationed on the wings of the men-at-arms, right, to fall on the enemy flanks. The Moors fought similarly, so this was all a bit normal in the Iberian Peninsula. There is a historiographical debate, as far as I'm aware, regarding like the nature of the proportion, let's say, of men-at-arms to jinetes, especially towards the end of this period, and specifically the war with Granada that mobilized lots of troops. And some say that when you look at even the pretty large numbers of the Spanish armies, that the actual proportion could reach 1 to 10, meaning that for one man-at-arm there would be 10 times more jinetes, right? Which is sort of, I mean, if you understand, like, it's not that Spain terrain would be particularly more different from elsewhere in Europe, but of course the open grounds, the hit and run tactics, the sort of large wastelands, especially left after the Reconquista, without much agricultural like resources, the, let's say, sort of, you know, predatory kind of warfare would have not just increased the doctrinal need for the jinetes, that could have simply just been a better option even for those forces that were deteriorating, impoverishing as the campaign progressed, right? But just a normal presence, because of the social background of Spain, especially on the frontier with Granada, with some sort of influences still from North Africa. We've seen it, in fact, in the Battle of Rio Salado, that and before, with speaking of the mobilization of the single local communities, like picking a horse and going out there and raiding was not even so unusual still by the end of the 15th century, especially in the south. There were lots of wars, of course, carried out with just similar proceedings in the north, right, between the Castilians and the Portuguese, as we were just seeing, right? It seems that the largest armies fielded by Castile in this period were the ones during the War of Granada between 1481 and 92, so with the full and final conquest of the citadel. So we are counting something between 10 and 30,000 cavalry and between 10 25,000 infantry. It seems especially a larger amount towards the closing stages of the war, also for just besieging the enemy capital with more infantry needed. Also the logistics for artillery that was becoming like a very heavy thing and wood in that siege. So especially the responsible for this increase in number would be the urban militias, and their mandat that again we will look at in another video. But this sort of makes sense. The way these forces were agglutinated is something, however, still fairly different from the times of Gonzalo de Cordoba in Italy. So there would be some chances and potential options in the air just provided by the Iberian military background that had, after all, sort of kept even many. You see, the Hidalgos were sort of gentry that accounted for like a significant proportion of the Spanish population, and these guys had made a living very often in these wars, in the protracted struggle against the Muslims, and the way it also affected culturally and identitarily the way the Spanish would go to war is something you can see in the Renaissance, in the conquest of the Americas, or in the Italian wars, etc., the 30th, and so on. But that's something that we will look at another time. We're talking modern warfare. But here it was just to give an idea, if anything, an introduction of most. We didn't talk much about Aragon or Catalonia, because after all, there are ways and ways, but they were similar forces, right? Just they were levied in different ways, also strategically. Like, it's really Castile and Portugal that have this massive, say, open ground interland to operate in, citadel after citadel, stronghold after stronghold, separated by substantial stretches in the Iberian plateau. But that's something, in fact, that we touched today on just superficially. We will surely have to make many more videos looking at all this stuff in greater depth. I'm glad, however, we discussed them. For today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.